In this video, I will show you how to use Nerdio Manager for WVD version 2.9 and later to manage WVD deployments that span multiple Azure sovereign clouds. Azure has multiple independent cloud infrastructures. There is what everyone's familiar with, which is known as Azure Commercial or Azure Global. It is the portal.azure.com URL that you go to manage resources in the Azure Global Cloud. But there are other Azure sovereign clouds. For example, there is a US government cloud that uses all independent data centers and regions, as well as a completely independent set of API endpoints and a completely different set of URLs. So for example, to get to the Azure government portal, you would navigate to portal.azure.us rather than portal.azure.com. And to authenticate, you would have a domain something like on Microsoft.us rather than Microsoft.com, and various other differences because they are in fact completely independent Azure clouds. There are other sovereign clouds. There is a Germany cloud for the German government. There is also a China cloud. And I'm sure over time, other Azure sovereign clouds will be coming online. In Nerdio Manager version 2.9, you can now manage a WVD deployment that spans both the Azure Commercial or the Azure Global and the Azure Government Cloud completely seamlessly. In order to connect a subscription from Azure Government Cloud or vice versa, there is now a new option available in the Nerdio Manager under the Settings Azure Environments page called Link Using App Credentials under the Azure Subscriptions tile. We click on this option, which is Link Azure Subscription by by client app, we'll see that there's some information that we have to provide. And if we click on this KB, it's actually going to tell us exactly what it is that we need in order to connect a subscription that is in a completely separate Azure cloud. In this case, Azure Government is what we're trying to link, but this could also be used to link subscriptions in the Azure Commercial Cloud. Now, there is a previous way of doing this linking, and that is now called Link Using Currently Logged In User. And if you click on that option, it will actually enumerate all of the subscriptions that are visible to the currently logged in user. And then you'll be able to select one of those subscriptions and link it automatically. So you will not need to fill out any information. But with this new method, there's going to be a few things that will need to be configured in advance of being able to perform this linking. So here's a summary of prerequisites. So in order to perform this linking process of connecting an Azure government subscription into the Nerdio Manager deployment, which happens to be in Azure Commercial or Azure Global, or vice versa. You can have a Nerdio Manager deployment in Azure Government and be linking a subscription from Azure Global. What you need, number one, is an app registration. This is basically a creation of a service principal in the Azure AD tenant of the subscription that you're trying to link. And once you do that app registration, you will obtain the client app ID and the app secret. And then if you look at the step-by-step instructions, you'll see exactly how that works. You'll navigate to the correct portal, click on new registration, give it a name, and then obtain the app ID and the secret as needed. Once this app registration is created, you will need to provide this app registration, the service principal, certain minimum permissions in order to be used for WVD deployments. Number one, that service principal will need to be a reader on the Azure subscription that you're trying to link. It will also need to be a backup reader on that same subscription. This is necessary if you're going to be using the automated desktop image backup functionality in Nerdio Manager. And then this service principal will need to be at least a contributor on one virtual network where you want to deploy session host VMs, and the contributor on at least one resource group that you want to use to create those session host VMs in. You will also need to know your Azure AD tenant ID, which is found on the Active Directory, the Azure Active Directory screen overview page in the Azure portal, as well as the subscription ID. So again, client app ID, client secret, certain set of permissions, Azure AD tenant ID, and the Azure subscription ID. Once we have this ready, all we need to do is click on link using app credentials, select the cloud in which the destination subscription resides that we want to link. So if we are going to use Azure Government Cloud, we'll select the US Government Cloud, type in the Azure AD tenant ID here, subscription ID here, client app ID and client secret, and click OK. And this will link our subscription just like this, and it will tell you that it's been linked with client app method, and it happens to be in the Azure Government Cloud. Once the subscription is linked, then you can start linking your networks and resource groups. For example, if you click on link to link a resource group and you look at the list, you will notice that your newly linked subscription in the government cloud is listed, and you can select any resource groups that are currently listed under that subscription. Again, remember the service principle we used in the previous step must have at least contributor on this group, one of these groups you will be linking. So that's step one. Then step two is linking a network. Same story. We're going to click on link. We're going to look at our list, and any networks within any of these resource groups, our service principal would need to be a contributor on that network. And then once we have linked our subscription, linked our resource group, linked our network, we are ready to use a Azure government subscription for deployment. Let's take a look at how that works. And this is going to be all very easy and familiar for those of you who have used Nerdio Manager in the past. So here I have a new workspace called Azure Government. If we click on it, and let's say we want to add a new dynamic host pool, you'll notice that I will have a network selector. And now in my network selector, I have my Azure Government subscription with my linked network listed right here. When I select it, that tells the system that the VMs that are going to be created to serve as session hosts are going to be in the Azure Government environment rather than in the Azure Global. Same thing, you'll notice now the resource group has been narrowed down to just the one in the Azure Government. The ones from the Azure Commercial, Azure Global are not available. And that's really it. So in this particular setup that I have in my demo environment right here, I have Nerdio Manager deployed into a subscription in Azure Global, which is where all of the WVD objects, as well as the identity, so the usernames and groups, are going to exist. For example, if a Azure government customer is using GCC High for their Office 365 and has identity that's already syncing into Azure Global, you will deploy Nerdio Manager into that cloud so that you can use the identity that already exists. But if that customer wants to deploy VMs into Azure Government, you will link an Azure Government subscription using the steps we went through, and then create your host pools in Azure Government. So what you can see here, I have two host pools. I have a staging and a test pool. And both of these, if we click on here, you'll see that I have two session hosts, and these session hosts reside in the US Government Virginia data center. So totally seamless and transparent from a admin and an end user perspective, but the VMs happen to run in Azure Government, but all are managed through the common familiar interface of Nerdio Manager for WVD. Hope you found this useful, and I look forward to seeing you in future videos.